From the Toad Hop Network studios
in Hollywood, this is the ToadHopNetwork.com.
It is strongly addictive.
Radio worth watching.
Radio worth watching. This is Vox Populi. Vox Populi. Now, here's your host, Sean Astin.
Well, hello, everybody. Mohammed, a guy named Dan Adler, who I've been friends with for 20 years, ran for Congress here. And I served as his campaign manager. We were not successful in our bid, but there were several debates. One was on Israel, and he's got a lot of ties to Israel and has done work on all sides of the issue, trying to advocate for peace. I'm going to have him listen in, and maybe we'll have is that all right? Can we have that conversation?
Of course, no problem.
Let me just update the listeners. Okay, so we have Mohammed Ansar is about to be on the phone with us, as well as Dan Adler. So we've got a really good. This is going to be a great conversation. If you guys want to learn about the Israeli-Palestine situation, this is a really smart call that's about to happen. Okay, Mohammed, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, Sean.
And Dan, can you hear Mohammed?
Yes, I can. Nice to meet you virtually, Mohammed.
Nice to meet you too, Dan.
So I just spent some good time with Dan, kind of unpacking what he sees happening on the ground right now. Mohammed, if you could give just spend a minute and characterize what you think's happening right now.
From a personal point of view and a professional point of view, obviously I'm a political and social commentator here in the UK on a lot of these issues. It's really important to position, I think, accurately for people who are looking from the outside, looking at the media reports, listening to what's happening, and seeing it as we would say, 6 of one and half a dozen of another. They will see news reports saying that Hamas and the Palestinians have been firing Qassam and other rockets into Israeli territory, and Israel are naturally just responding accordingly and looking to defend themselves. And I think the first step would be to clear up any misconceptions around that. We have to remember, first and foremost, that Gaza is effectively an open refugee camp. There are something like 1.6 million Palestinians living in this area. 75% of those people living there are refugees. Of those refugees, 50% are living in 8 refugee camps in Gaza. They are 90% dependent on aid. That makes them the most aid-dependent region in the world, and technically makes them one of the most impoverished regions in the world, if not the most impoverished region in the world. They have an incredibly young age profile. Somewhere in the region of 800 to 850,000 of them are below the age of 18. Now, we can argue and debate and discuss the attacks in Operation Cast Lead in 2008, 4 years ago. But what we do know is that Amnesty International went in afterwards, and there were a number of violations of human rights on the Israeli side, including attacking ambulances, schools, universities, and even UN enclaves. But one of the things we did notice is that throughout all of those attacks, Amnesty said that there was nowhere for the people to go because Israel controls the border. And for your callers and your listeners, remember one thing, that the Gaza Strip, we are talking about a tiny, tiny slice of land, which is about 4 miles across, 25 miles long, and in round figures, about 150 square miles. It's not very big. And 1.6 million people densely populated in there. Amnesty International essentially said there's nowhere for these people to go. Now, in the early 2000s, the US, the West, Europe, EU, a number of regions and countries asked for democratic elections to take place. Those democratic elections went ahead, and 24 out of roughly about 84 areas voted for Hamas to be the democratically elected leaders. Now, we may not like that. But what then followed was particularly difficult, because we saw U.S. money going into Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, who essentially waged war against Hamas. And Hamas had essentially no option other than to take control back in 2007, back from the Palestinian Authority, to say, well, we've won the democratic vote and the democratic election for this area, including Gaza, and now we have to fight for it to represent it properly. So we have lawfully and democratically elected leaders of an area where they're doing the best they can for those people, but they have a blockade on the sea border, on the 25-mile sea border with the Mediterranean Sea. There is a blockade on the Egyptian side and on the Israeli side, and these poor people are kettled. They're poor, they're hungry, they're scared, they're fearful. And and I'm trying to be as balanced as possible, but Israel is reputedly, arguably, a nuclear state. It receives anywhere between £3 and £5 billion of funding from the US. It is in the region a superpower, and it has the technological, the military capacity, and an overwhelming strike force to be able to attack these poor people who are effectively in an open cage on the edge. So
why would Hamas launch I made this case a little just before Dan came on. Dan, I'll pull you in a second here, but why would Hamas then, if it's advocating for its people, fire those rockets? What are they attempting to achieve by doing that?
I think the rockets thing is really, really interesting because if you want to address it Islamically, and I think we can look at it politically and in a humanitarian context without looking at it religiously. However,
just practical. Just talk to me practically. Somebody's firing rockets against the people that are clearly going to defend itself and have superior military and technological overmatch. Why would they do that?
Okay, let me come back to you on that. One of the things we know about the rockets that are being launched, in 10 years, hundreds and hundreds of rockets have been launched from the Palestinian territories, from Gaza, towards Israel. There's no question about that. However, Israel has this iron dome, I think they call it an iron dome, which shoots down rockets, and the Israeli casualties over 10 years have totaled 10. 10 Israeli, I think we've had 3 today.
Can't imagine that, Dan, I can't imagine you're going to agree with that figure.
Well, okay, but they haven't.
It's not an issue of whether one agrees with it. It's an issue of the fact that they haven't inflicted more damage is something to be grateful and thankful for, but it doesn't excuse the activities. I mean, I'm not responding to all of the other things that Mohammed said, some of which, I can agree with and some of which I would take serious issue with, but just focus on that last comment. To say that if, for example, Mexico were firing rockets into San Diego for 10 years, and thank God that they didn't do much damage or kill many people, would not be a reason why the United States would therefore say, oh, that's great, so they're trying to make a political point and we'll respect their ability to make that political point. Yes, it's true that Hamas was democratically elected. Yes, it's true, in fact, that our United States government helped call for those elections. Yes, it's true that Hamas is trying to make its points. And yes, it's also true that there are 1.5 plus million people living in a very small geographic area. However, it is also true that Israel unilaterally pulled out of that area to leave control to what ended up being Hamas. It wasn't a Palestinian Authority. Okay, it's also true that Israel does not enforce a blockade for any kind of humanitarian issue, and it's also true, by the way, that the Egyptian border itself is at times opened up, and whatever criticism one wants to level against Israel, one can also level against Egypt for not allowing the citizens of the Gaza Strip to go into Egypt. And lastly, in terms of big points, the 4 to 5 million pounds of U.S. aid is actually, I believe, much smaller a number than that, and it's also has a comparable number, as we were talking about before Mohammed got on the phone, of aid that goes to Egypt as well, and of course enormous aid that comes through UNRWA, the United Nations Refugees Relief Organization, and all sorts of other entities to the Gaza Strip. Now, the problem is, I believe that the U.S. government recognizes Hamas as still an entity with which they will not have any direct interaction because of its status as a terrorist organization, and therefore we cannot give money, the U.S. government cannot give money directly to Hamas, but there's an incredible amount of aid that goes into the Gaza Strip. There is a booming economy in many parts of the country. There's many parts of the region. There are enormous initiatives in new media and other companies that have been launched there, and there's an incredible amount of stuff that's happening with a population which I agree with your description, is living under very difficult circumstances. But those circumstances are largely a result of the government that is controlling its people, not of what the 1.5 million people necessarily want.
I thought they were democratically elected, Dan.
They were democratically elected at a time when the alternative was a corrupt Palestinian Authority, and when very wisely Hamas went into the Gaza Strip and provided medical services, food, education for children, and a bunch of other infrastructure that was not being provided, or not being provided well or effectively, or probably without corruption from the PA. And in light of that, when it came to a democratic election and people were asked whether they wanted to support what they had seen as a corrupt Palestinian Authority, or whether they wanted the alternative, which stayed away from its ideological positions and instead focused on its humanitarian work, many of them, understandably so, went for the one that was providing its humanitarian services.
All right, so
Dan, can I come back to you on a couple of those issues, if that's okay?
I interrupted you.
Sure.
I interrupted you, Mohammed, because the figure seemed weird to me. But Dan basically agreed, so I apologize for challenging that figure.
No, that's okay. Look, there's an awful lot of misconception here, and it's very difficult when we follow the mainstream news sources. Firstly, because the Israelis have allowed no embedded journalists to be in Gaza. I know there's one guy on Twitter called @HarryFear, as it sounds, Harry the name and then fear as in to be scared, Harry Fear. He has a Ustream channel, I know, and he's in Gaza City, and he provides on-the-ground live coverage, and literally bombs are going off and his building is shaking, and that's going on around him. And so other than that, all of the other embedded journalists are on the Israeli side. Now, a couple of things that Dan said I really need to address. Firstly, you said Israel provides no blockade. Well,
no, he said humanitarian. He said no humanitarian blockade.
Absolutely, absolutely. And just 2 or 3 years ago, we saw the Mavi Marmara, which was a flotilla which carried not only politicians but activists and humanitarian aid to Gaza, which was stopped in the middle of the sea, not even in Israeli waters, actually. It was attacked by helicopters. Israeli paratrooper forces came out of the helicopters, descended the ships, and then shot, I think it was a dozen people, they may have been slightly less, dead. And that has been roundly set upon in the international media and by human rights organizations and Amnesty International. So, firstly, they were just taking humanitarian aid, food, building equipment, medical supplies.
They weren't only taking humanitarian aid. I don't think we need to go back 3 years.
Dan, let him finish.
Your comment was, no, Israel does not block humanitarian aid. And I think if there's more nuance to it than that, and I think one thing we have to be clear is that humanitarian aid has been stopped. One other thing I wanted to address also is that if we look back at what happened in 2008, because the general consensus seems to be that this is going to look like Operation Cast Lead 2.0. When we look at what happened in 2008, in North Gaza, just as a small example, in North Gaza, the figures we had, UN-approved figures, after the attack, a cessation of the attack in January of 2009, was that 26 bombs were falling on every square kilometer in North Gaza. And 172 women and children were killed there. On Gaza City itself, we had 13 bombs dropping on every square kilometer, and this is one of the most densely populated places on the planet, where there's nowhere to run and nowhere to hide and no safe zones, and you cannot even cross the border. We had 13 bombs dropping on every square kilometer, and it killed 113 women and children. On day one of the attack in 2008, almost 300 people were killed. Now, we are not talking about two equal forces, and I think there is a myth which is being peddled, and that myth needs to be debunked, which is that somehow this is a war. When it's stones versus tanks, when it's paper aeroplanes versus airstrikes, you have to remember that the missiles coming from Gaza are falling on a vastly depopulated area. Other than Sderot and a couple of other places in and around that area, that is essentially a depopulated zone. That region where those missiles are dropping is largely depopulated. This is, for the first time this evening, we've seen a missile able to reach Tel Aviv, It may well have fell in the sea, as the Israeli authorities are saying, but we know that the air sirens went off in Tel Aviv this evening, and it's the first time since the end of the Gulf War that we've heard those air sirens going off. But this explains why these are homemade munitions which are being fired into the air as some pathetic and pitiful resistance towards Israeli aggression. People in Gaza are under siege, and let's remember one thing. These are the people, they are the indigenous people of that land, right? It would be absolutely absurd for the Australians to take over, for Europeans to take over Australia, and then when the Aboriginals are throwing spears back at the Westerners, we are saying, oh, look at their aggression. This is absolutely an appalling and revisionist account of history. And we have to be very, very careful and very, very clear about Western exceptionalism in terms of saying, well, actually, somehow Western or Israeli interests or Israeli lives have vastly more weight attached to them than the lives of Palestinians.
On the contrary, the Israelis repeatedly have gone out of their ways to communicate to the people of Gaza and the people around the globe. And by the way, remember, I am not a representative in any way of the Israeli government. I have somebody who spends a lot of time in Israel, spends a lot of time in the West Bank, deals with all sorts of Arab Israelis, Palestinians, and others, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and believes that all of them, ought to be fairly represented and all beings. But, I don't think it's helpful in this conversation, unless we're going to do this for a couple of days rather than a few more minutes, to go and start history lessons on, who is where in the region doing what to whom. Nor do I think it's very constructive to go back and talk about the flotilla, which we all know, by all accounts, including all sorts of reports, many of which were subsequently recanted, that the flotilla was warned that it would be coming into waters that were officially recognized by the international community as being under a blockade. Israel repeatedly warned the members of the flotilla not to enter those waters or threatened that they would come on and do something to those ships. I actually have met with and spoken with paratroopers who were on and part of that process. You may remember that they went on the ships unarmed for the most part. You may remember that they did all sorts of things to try to both decrease whatever may have developed and also to respect human life, but to do it in such a way that was recognizing what was happening. And what was happening was an act of provocation, which is the same thing that we're describing here in terms of what's been happening coming out of Gaza. Again, the fact that the rockets are made by individuals, if that's true, rather than brought in from Iran, the fact that they are falling on not densely populated areas, and the fact that they are, thank God, not killing many people, do not in any way forgive the action that is meant to provoke. And furthermore, the fact that Israel ends up, when retaliating for that aggression, having to fire into areas that have civilian populations, is done at great attempt to minimize that. Warnings, literally dialed to hundreds of thousands of cell phones, which no army on the face of the earth goes through the trouble to do. Flyers dropped into civilian populations, telling people to get out of the way of what is going to happen. Bombs that are only sound bombs being dropped on munitions factories first to warn people to get out of the way before their live ammunition. But when a government chooses to use civilian shields of children in schools and of victims in hospitals, then unfortunately there are going to be civilian casualties. And when the belief is that a civilian casualty is, in defense of its land, somehow acceptable, Israel does not believe it is or should be acceptable. And you will note even, earlier this week, the trouble that Israel goes through to try to minimize any civilian casualty and the risk that Israel puts itself at over and over and over again. And I'd be more than happy to put you face to face with.
Hang on,
go ahead.
Hang on, Mohammed. Hang on. Finish. Hold on.
You've said
Mohammed. Hold on one second.
Mohammed. He said.
Mohammed, just hold on one second. Finish your point, Dan.
No, that's fine. Go ahead. Ask my question.
All right, go for it.
No, thank you. Netanyahu said exactly the same thing today, which he said he wanted to have surgical strikes and he wanted to go and minimize civilian casualties. in 2008, and the only reason I'm talking about 2008 is it gives us a very accurate template, and there's nothing to suggest that Israel is going to behave in any way differently. In 2008, we know that Israel used white phosphorus. We know that they killed 23 emergency medical personnel. They've injured 50. We know they fired on medical teams. We know today reports from Gaza are telling us that they fired on ambulances. We know that in 2008, Israel systematically targeted hospitals, food supplies, as I said, UN enclaves, and press agencies, as well as schools and universities. We know that in Gaza, there is nowhere for Palestinian families to run. There are no safe zones. They are so heavily populated. They have the 7th highest growth rate on the planet. They're one of the most densely populated regions and one of the most impoverished.
But Mohammed,
people probably should not be firing rockets from those places.
Dan, hold on one second, Dan. Mohammed,
how can you have surgically accurate strikes?
Mohammed, this is the question that I interrupt you on when you mentioned the low number of fatalities on the Israeli side over a period of time. The point I had asked you and that you were starting to respond to was, why would they fire those rockets from there? Who's going to benefit? I mean, I understand that if there's a feeling of frustration, there's a feeling of like desperation if they're homemade, if they are indeed homemade, like Dan said, as opposed to stuff that's coming in either financed by or shuttled through Iran, from Iran or anybody else. Why would the leadership disadvantage its people by shooting those rockets? It doesn't seem in their interest.
It's a fair question. Sean, it's a good question. And I always like your questions because you're very fair and you're very balanced, and this is far from being that news network. In response to that, the reason I spoke to Dan and I spoke in such a way to look back at our history and our recollection of history is that is their land. That is their land, and for the last 4.
So you're saying it's an emotional reason? The reason they're launching those?
No, absolutely not. Hold a second. Look, if I don't know if you're in LA tonight, but if you were in LA and I came along with an army, and I'm not proposing to, so all you on the far right, calm down. If I came with an army and I put Los Angeles to siege for 4 years, and people were starving to death, and you were hungry, and I was blockading aid that was coming in. Gaza has effectively been under siege for 4 years. 4 years, and we have ludicrous numbers of deaths and horrific conditions in those 8 refugee camps. People are living in an open prison. They are effectively in an open cage under siege. After what period of time would people in Los Angeles start shooting over the wall? After what period of time would you start making homemade munitions and throwing them at me?
But Dan made this point earlier about how Hamas had filled a humanitarian void by providing education and other social services, and this is what enabled their democratic victory. These are not stupid people. It's such the logical disconnect. I mean, there must be some other political goal to be gained by throwing those rockets against an anguished flailing of an impoverished people. There must be some other strategic goal for them. There must be. Dan, what?
By the way, there's a region that gave more aid than almost any region on the face of the earth. And by the way, your comment about journalists, the ones who behead journalists are Hamas. The Israelis suffer from the fact that they have an entirely free and open media and press. It has caused them far more problems than it should over time because it is a free and open society. Okay,
well, you might want to talk to Rachel Corrie's family about that before you start accusing the Israelis of some kind of moral exceptionalism when it comes to treating journalists. Rachel Corrie was wearing a press flax jacket and in broad daylight was shot and killed by Israeli soldiers. So let's wind down the rhetoric slightly on body counts, because this is kind of
Mohammed, your accusation stands. No, that Israel targeted media operations and went after killing.
Just today, my friends at the BBC, and I'm a contributor regularly on BBC One, and you can look me up on YouTube if you're not sure, but my friends from the BBC have reported that Jihad al-Mashawi, his 11-month-old son, he works for BBC Arabic in Gaza, his 11-month-old son was killed as an Israeli airstrike fell on his house, killed his sister-in-law, and killed his 11-month-old son. And he's shown on Al Jazeera and the BBC this afternoon and this evening, crying, pleading to the camera and saying, "What did my son do?"
Was he? Are you asserting that Are you asserting that he was targeted?
Go back to what Sean asked before, Mohammed. Why there are diplomatic channels that can be entered into to try to address the issues that you're describing. It is why, in particular, Israel unilaterally pulled out of Gaza and nearly ripped its own country apart to do it, amidst much turmoil and much criticism and much disagreement inside its country, believing that if it pulled out of Gaza and gave Gaza to the control of the people who wanted to control it, that Israel would be in a stronger position overall to be closer to peace. And they ripped their country apart. They pulled settlers out of Gaza, and they ripped them from their homes, and thank God there was no blood shed in doing it. If you want to have discussions, if there want to be negotiations, there are channels to do it. Firing rockets indiscriminately until you push people into a point of saying enough already after 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 over 10 years. The fact that, thank God, they haven't done much killing is a nice fact, but it does not change the dynamics of what Sean asked the question about. Why use that as a means of provocation so that Israel needs to do something in order to protect a civilian population?
I'm happy to. Do you know what? That is a really great point, Dan, because I think talking, advocacy, diplomacy has to be the way forward. And let's look at some of the diplomacy. In 2008, in November 2008, the 6-month-old ceasefire between Hamas and Israel was broken by Israel when they killed 6 Palestinians. Hamas then fired 35 rockets into Israel, causing no losses. Israel then responded within a month with massive airstrikes, killing 257 people and injuring 597 people on one day. This is Israeli diplomacy, and anybody who knows about the region and can look up these facts. These are
well,
not.
By the way, if people want to start looking up facts, they can just take the last one you mentioned. Rachel Corrie was not shot by an IDF soldier. Rachel Corrie, unfortunately, was crushed underneath a bulldozer with many warnings in something that was absolutely qualified as an accident. She was not shot by anybody.
All right, so guys, so I'm looking at my.
IDF. She was crushed by them.
You guys. All right, here's the thing. It's 1:58. I have to. We're going to go off now with the show. There's a couple of points I want to make just as we go off. First of all, Mohammed, thank you so much for your passionate, articulate, just enumeration of facts. Dan, thank you so much for your clear presentation of facts. It's funny because there are two things that one thing that I said before I knew I was going to get both of you on the phone, and that was that analogies are really rough in these conversations. Like we should probably not use analogies like Mexico and California, Los Angeles. They problematize things a little bit, I think, too much, and the illustrations that you benefit are not served by the other dissembling that inevitably flows from it. The other thing is, the reason I reached out to both of you is because I felt really just totally impotent in the face of what's happening right now, because even though I've tried to understand the history of this stuff, I really don't get it. And so I also realize that history and facts are very hard to grapple with. And the last point, and so it requires a commitment of time and energy from all sides. From Dan, I don't think either one of you expected to be on the phone this long, but from all sides to be able to be patient and listen to each other. This is a little microcosm of the dynamics that exist over there, and the sort of, I don't know, maybe it's the fourth point I'm trying to make, is that when we load up there is so much horror to go around. There is so much injustice and pain, and one man's collateral damage is another man's constant boot on the throat. It I think we should identify those moments where what we want to give ourselves to in the conversation is an expression of that affinity with the pain of one side and another side. I know both of you guys, so I know that there is affinity for the suffering on both sides. So what I want to exact from you two right now is a commitment to, at some point, I don't know when, but at some point in the future, to come on the show earlier in the show, and I'll maybe find a little structure for the conversation. But I think that the future of peace in the region is going to come from smart guys like the two of you who have both demonstrated a capacity to see things from the other guy's point of view, to, in a conversation in front of others, demonstrate the mechanics or the trajectory for peace and reconciliation.
And it is why the future of the region and its God hope for peaceful reconciliation will come from organizations like Seed Peace, which does precisely what you're describing by bringing together smart young people from all sides with a mutual respect for the other, a willingness to engage around each other's narratives and facts, and a desire to make positive change. I would take your suggestion one step further, though, although I'm happy to take you up on your offer to go on the show earlier in a broadcast with Mohammed, and instead suggest, Sean, that you and whomever else you would like, and any of your listeners that are so inclined, to get on a plane and to go to the region, and that we should all meet there and look at facts on the ground together and begin to engage in a meaningful dialogue so that people begin to understand what we're talking about, how close all of these areas are to each other, what East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem look like in terms of the same city with people across the street from each other, and how every single day there is wonderful coexistence going on. And that is where we should have the discussion, and that is where we should see what is happening constructively, and that is where we should plot a vision for the future.
I like it. It'd feel more comfortable if people stop hurling rock at each other.
I would be more than happy to do that. And I've really enjoyed this evening, and I'm a regular contributor to your show, Sean. I think it was the Buddha who said that better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. And I think on that basis, I'd be more than happy to come out and try and talk and have a live dialogue about, actually, we've looked back at what's happened in the past, we've looked at what's happening now. I think the important point that Dan raises and that you've raised is, how do we talk about how we move forward?
All right, so it's going to be the first Vox Populi remote broadcast. I'm excited about it. We'll figure out how to get that done. Gentlemen, thank you so much for calling in, and we'll pick it up again soon.
A great pleasure.
Thank you very much. Nice meeting you again, Mohammed. Bye, Sean.
All right. Wow, that was exciting. It's good to know smart people.
It's smart to know good people.